morning, sir. Since our Director General sir has joined, uh, we shall start the program soon. Dr. Partha, are you there?
Yes, Ruchira, we can start.
So we will start here. So a very good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ruchira, and on behalf of National Institute of Rural Development and Panchayati Raj, New Delhi, I extend a warm welcome to all the dignitaries who have joined here today for our fifth webinar of Evidence-Based Policy and Action Roundtable. Today's webinar, How Gender Works, focuses on a crucial and possibly the most complex development goal, that is gender equality. The fifth SDG is critical as globally women and men face different challenges in full participation in the developmental processes, representation, and decent work opportunities. Evidence points to the gendered nature of the inequalities in all dimensions of well-being. The practical integration of gender in all dimensions of development required the understanding of how identities intersect and influence the targets of all forms of well-being and development. For today's event, we shall have three leading scholars of gender and development of our time to engage in a discussion on the intersections of gender and development goals. We extend our gratitude to Dr. G. Narendra Kumar, Director General NIRD PR, for agreeing to chair the webinar. We also welcome all the invited experts for the consultation, our esteemed audience, including my colleagues, scholars, enthusiasts, and functionaries of rural development, and our beloved students. Before I invite our Honorable Chair to make a welcome remark, let me quickly introduce the speakers. We are greatly honored to have Professor Ashwini Deshpande discussing the gendered nuances of employment trends in India. Her talk will be followed by Dr. K.G. Sandhya, who will share the latest findings from the study on adolescents in UP. Finally, we shall have Professor Lekha Chakraborty, who will be discussing the scope and experience of gender budgeting in India. Before I give a detailed introduction to each of the speakers, I would request first Dr. G. Narendra Kumar, our Director General, to make a welcome remark and officially start the program. Sir, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ruchira. I think it's a great seminar that is being organized by Ruchira as a part of NIRD Thought Leadership series on how gender works, intersection of identities and development goals. And I welcome the panelists, the discussants for this workshop. There are three very topical issues which have been identified for this workshop on gender-specific differences in health, knowledge, and outcomes among adolescents. Dr. Sandhya, I'm sorry. Professor Lekha Chakraborty speaking about gender budgeting. Professor Ashwini Deshpande speaking about gender-specific differences in employment post-COVID-19 lockdown. These are, I think, very, very important issues, and the participants, I'm sure, will benefit immensely from the knowledge and experience of the panelists today. I thought I will point you to some of the issues and my experiences with gender budgeting and how gender budgeting has really panned out compared to what we were initially expecting gender budgeting to do. As Ruchira was mentioning, the SDG 5 on gender justice is a very important SDG, and we need to take concrete measures to improve our performance on the SDG 5, because India's ranking on SDG 5 index is about 33.2, whereas some countries such as Finland have already reached almost 90% levels. And there's therefore a lot of scope and need for improvement in the SDG 5 achievements. And particularly, we see that even though health achievements are not so badly off for Indian women, but the educational achievements in terms of the mean years of schooling, or in terms of the female labor participation rate, which is classically very low, it touched about 23.7 levels. Now I think it is about 34.2 or so. But nevertheless, the female labor participation rate continues to be a matter of concern in the country, and we need to take measures to improve that significantly. Even in our highest legislative body, the parliament, the representation of women is about half of the representation of women in their parliaments or the highest legislative bodies in various countries. Our representation of women in our parliament is about 11% compared to international figures of about 22%. All these go to show that we have substantial catch up to do in terms of SDG 5 and a number of steps to be taken to do well on the SDG 5 index. And gender budgeting is a very important policy tool, a tool which has been extensively used now for about 15 to 16 years. And this was introduced at a point of time when I was Secretary Social Welfare in the government of Delhi, the city government of Delhi. And we used to have very close interaction with the Women and Child Development Department in the Government of India. The Secretary used to think that a lot of initiatives that are taken in Delhi can act as showcase for other states of the country, and therefore she wanted that gender budgeting should be introduced in Delhi in a significant measure. Of course, certain other initiatives that we had taken, such as the Ladli Yojana, became famous all over the country. Many states have got different names for that. Some people call it Ladli Lakshmi, some people call it other names. And now we have the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao scheme. So all these are sort of triggered by this Ladli scheme. Likewise, the secretary of the time, Mrs. Reva Nair, wanted that the gender budgeting should be introduced in Delhi government in a substantial measure, and we should take it forward. Then it came into the mainstream in about 2005-06 in the national budget. The gender budgeting came up. The basic idea was, as you all know, to mainstream gender concerns and link them with the budget, taking into consideration the gaps in the service delivery and the status of the women, and what policy interventions they need to be made, and what monitoring mechanisms there would be, and what kind of outcomes would be achieved through improved policies and programs for women's welfare. So those were some of the key elements of the gender budgeting process, and that has rolled on now for 15 to 16 years. If we look back and see how the gender budgeting has performed in all these years, then we don't find it extremely exciting, in the sense that the overall gender budget, so to say, has stagnated around 5%. It has not gone beyond that. And in the recent past, in the budget of 2021, it fell down to 4.4%. And with a significant fall of about almost 26% in the gender budget numbers itself from the previous year to the budget of 2021. And the gender budget as a whole has tended to stagnate below 1% of the GDP, and with the latest budget, it reached the levels of about 0.7% or so. And more significantly, we see the skew in the way the gender budget is structured in the Government of India. As we all know, there are two types of elements to the gender budgeting. One is the women-specific programs, and women's programs which support women's development, the A and B type of programs. But all these programs, about 90% of the allocations of gender budget are only in 5 departments, and such as the rural development, obviously the women and child development department, health, education, and agriculture. So remaining all departments, about 80 departments in the departments and ministries in the Government of India, remaining about 75 ministries and departments account for only 10% of the gender budget. So this is the kind of skew that is there in the gender budgeting process that needs for urgent correction, so that the gender mainstreaming, as we are looking at, really happens across these schemes and programs of all departments, all ministries of the country. More so, 50% of the gender budget allocation is only in 5 schemes of the government of India. So these distortions call for corrections. The way we move forward with the gender budgeting, it has to be mainstream still in the true sense. It is sort of, we are paying lip service to gender budgeting, and mainstreaming of it in the true sense hasn't happened. So that's something we need to take urgent steps in that direction. And I'm sure that this workshop will focus on this, because I can say it's very well structured. That initially we're talking about the status of women, especially the adolescents, with respect to health knowledge, outcomes, and from there come to the gender budgeting, the policy interventions, and then come to the current situation of how gender budgeting has been affected and how women's issues have been affected during the COVID pandemic. COVID pandemic, of course, was a tsunami which hit us all through. We've now been through 2 waves, and expecting the 3rd wave, as you all know. It has been a crisis that we all faced, and when we face a crisis, the ugly side of life comes up front. Becomes difficult to hide it during a crisis. Crisis throws up the underbelly of our society, of our system. And so it was with respect to gender justice or the non-availability of it. Some of the indicators which sprung up during the COVID waves were that the unpaid caregiving work, which is about 5 hours contribution by the women, that increased substantially, whereas the men's paid caregiving work or domestic work remained stagnant about 1.5 hours or so. Yes, because a lot of people staying at home, the children, elderly, and so on. Therefore, the burden on women increased substantially, and that resulted in detracting the women from contributing to mainstream work. And worker participation also substantially decreased, especially job losses due to COVID, etc. were about, while they were about 14% among women, only 1% among men. There were closure of Anganwadis took place, because in Delhi we launched another innovative scheme providing hot cooked meals to Anganwadi women and children attending Anganwadis. That was way back in about 2004, 5 or so. Surprised when I was talking to some people in Delhi who said that it is no longer going on. The hot cooked meals are not going on. So I was taken aback to say that the scheme which we put together with so much diligence and so well structured, which ran 15 to 16 years, why it had to be shut down. But the silver lining to the cloud was that it was temporarily stopped because of the closure of the Anganwadis. But I was also told that there were very serious effects on the malnutrition of women and children. And a lot of good work which was done through the years got affected because of the closure of the Anganwadis. And because the nutrition upgradation is an ongoing process, takes several years to happen. And all that work for nutrition upgradation, which was done over several years, that was set back due to closure of these Anganwadis, non-availability of supplementary nutrition and other facilities. So such were the sort of parodies of the COVID situation. But unfortunately, we did not sort of gear ourselves up well in terms of the gender equity and gender justice terms, because the gender budgeting did not cater to these discriminating factors and issues which were thrown up by the COVID situation. It was like business as usual as far as the gender budgeting was concerned. And there was only 2% of the gender budget was spent on these issues such as social protection, domestic violence, upskilling, providing better transport facilities, digital literacy, and also dealing better with the unpaid care work. So our gender budgeting system was not flexible enough to deal with the emerging realities. So how do we therefore reinforce the gender budgeting system? One, to remove these distortions in the system of gender budgeting, to make it more vibrant to deal with the emerging realities and the emerging situations such as COVID. I think these are matters of concern that we should focus on, and I'm sure that this workshop will come out with some solutions and a way forward and how we can strengthen some of these aspects. And I once again welcome the speakers in this workshop and the participants to this workshop. With these few words, I would like to take leave at this stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for your encouraging words and setting the tone of the workshop. Yes, we fight for bread and we fight for roses too. With these words, I would like to start the program. And our first speaker, we have made a small change because I know Professor Ashwini Deshpande is not feeling well. So we have brought her session first. And we will start with a discussion of these gendered nuances of the labor market and how they have changed and how we need to again rethink these policies after the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me introduce Professor Deshpande to those who don't know about her work. Of course, to a student of economics, she needs no new introduction, but for our friends who have joined from different aspects of different fields of development, Professor Deshpande is a professor of economics and the founding director of Center for Economic Data and Analysis, which is CEDA, at Ashoka University. Her PhD and early publications have been on the international debt crisis of the 1980s. Subsequently, she has been working on the economics of discrimination and affirmative action with a focus on gender and caste in India. She has authored and edited many books and scientific articles, including The Grammar of Caste, Economic Discrimination in Contemporary India, an Oxford University Press publication, Affirmative Action in India by Oxford University Press, Boundaries of Clan and Color Transnational Comparisons of Intergroup Disparity by Routledge, Globalization and Development, a Handbook of New Perspective by Oxford University Press, Capital Without Borders, Challenges to Development by the Anthem Press, and Global Economic Crisis and the Developing World, Routledge, London. Her work during the global pandemic on employment market has been widely published, and of course I'll be sharing a few of them with you as we go about with her talk. Professor Deshpande received the Exim Bank Award for Outstanding Dissertation, now called the IERA Award, in 1994, and in 2007 VK.R.V. Rao Award for Indian Economists Under 45. I would like to invite Professor Deshpande to start her talk today. Welcome, and thank you for agreeing to join the session. Over to you now.
Thank you, Ruchira, and thank you for accommodating my situation. How much time would you like me to speak for?
We have roughly 20 minutes per speaker, but it's completely flexible, and as we go, we'll see. And you can also make it interactive.
Yeah, I'll speak for about 15, 20 minutes. I was going to present some results from my paper, which I will still do, but I think I will step back a little and also talk more broadly about gender gaps in the labor market rather than only focusing on COVID, because they also help us understand the impact of COVID-19 on these gender gaps. So all over the world, as COVID-19 pandemic hit and economies went into shutdown mode, and as there were massive job losses, in terms of absolute numbers of people who lost jobs or lost employment, elsewhere in the world, especially the developed countries, more women lost jobs than men. And the reason for that was that the kinds of sectors that got impacted because of COVID, hospitality industry, hotels, restaurants, etc. Then the retail sector, malls and so on, entertainment, cinema theaters, and so on and so forth, theater showing plays and all that. Caregiving individuals like nannies, au pairs, maids, etc. Because women predominantly are employed in these sectors, in absolute numbers, because of the requirements also of social distancing, more women lost employment in the developed countries than men did. In India, the estimates of the early job losses came from from a private data set called Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, because the NSS survey has only come out now. we see from that data, which is what I used also for my paper, that in absolute numbers, more men lost employment than women in the first month of the pandemic, which is the April 2020, when there was complete lockdown. Other than essential services, everything, all economic activity came to a standstill. And the reason that in India you see this pattern in contrast to the global pattern is because of the pre-existing gaps in employment before the pandemic. So far more men were employed before the pandemic than women. And so when the job losses happened, more men lost jobs than women in absolute numbers. But because of the very large pre-existing gaps, what I've tried to argue and show through my research is that that's not probably the only way to assess the gendered impact of COVID-19. What you have to account for are the pre-existing gaps in the labor market. And when you account for that, in other words, when you compare people who were employed before the pandemic, men and women, and then try to assess the job losses, then you find that conditional on being employed pre-pandemic, women were, significantly more likely to have lost their jobs than men had. So there was a disproportionate toll that the COVID-19 pandemic took, the first month of the lockdown took on the male-female employment gaps. This situation changed a little bit during the course of the pandemic, and employment has gone through ups and downs in different months. And for example, by December 2020, we had gone back to the same level of the gender gap in employment as was the case before the pandemic, whereas in August 2020, it had worsened again, and so on. So these ups and downs are going on, but the overall, takeaway from this story is that when an unanticipated crisis hits the economy, women who already are less likely to be employed are more likely to be rendered unemployed, right? So I think what the labor market tells us is the way it works is that women find it hard to enter, but they are, their exits are faster than men. And I have another, paper that I'm doing with my PhD student at Ashoka, which looks at the pre-COVID gender gaps. We look at entry and exit of men and women in the labor market and out of it, and we find that the same pattern, which is women find it more difficult to enter, but they are they are let go easily. And in that paper, we also look at the demonetization, which is November 2016. And that was a period when women's labor force participation was on a declining trend. And so there was a part of the decline that just was happening because of the trend. But around immediately after November 2016, women's employment declined by 2 percentage points more than men's employment. So what this shows is that there seems to be the following issue, which is that when jobs are scarce, then men are more likely to get those scarce jobs than women do. So in all this discussion of women's participation in work, there's been a lot of focus on social norms and cultural norms, etc., that keep women from entering the labor market. What I have been trying to do through my work is to point out that, of course, those are true and those have to be addressed. But what gets often missed out in this discussion is the demand for women's labor. So, for example, if you look at educational achievements of women, they have been significantly increasing over the last 10 to 20 years. And the increase in women's educational attainment has actually been greater than the increase in men's educational attainment. So just on account of the higher education, women's employability has increased, but we don't see that getting reflected in the labor market. And I think that we need to focus on the constraints that prevent women, that result in a situation where there aren't enough suitable jobs for women, especially in rural India, because that's the sector where you've seen the biggest decline in female employment. So if you look at the employment opportunities in rural India outside of family enterprises, outside of family farms, essentially it's either school teachers or Asha Anganwadi ANMs, that sector, or there is NREGA work. But educational attainment of women is increasing in rural India. So not everybody would like to do NREGA work. Their aspirations have gone up. They would like to do, other different kinds of work. So I think expansion and strengthening of non-farm employment in rural India is an absolute priority, which will absorb the huge reservoir of labor power in the form of unemployed women who would like to work. Despite all the constraints, despite all the social norms, etc. Because survey after survey, in NSS, you find when women are asked about, would you like to work? And their answer is typically yes. And in this paper with Jitendra Singh, my PhD student, we have actually shown that we have looked at every other explanation that might have accounted for the decline, and we don't really find that to be significant. And so, and what, in fact, if you look at from 1980 up to today, if you look at the increase in the population in working age group, which is 15 plus, all right, and the increase in jobs for both men and women, that gap has been widening. So jobs, of course, have been increasing as well as the working age population, but the increase in jobs is at a far lower pace than the increase in the working age population. So it's an overall scarcity of jobs. And that overall scarcity disproportionately affects women, more than it affects men. And so when jobs are scarce, women tend to get left out, from the job market. Now, this will require all kinds of interventions to fix this problem. Okay, one, of course, is, for example, provision of childcare for urban women. That's often a very big constraint. In rural India, that's not such a big constraint because there are multi-generational families, there are extended families. Often the work is on farms and family enterprises where the women can have the children playing on the side, which is not an ideal situation, but it at least enables women to work on those in these farms. But in urban India, you can't just leave your children unattended. And so, again, you find in construction sites, children are playing around in that debris, which is again not an ideal situation. But for many women, they are not able to get to join work, even at home, without adequate childcare facilities. So I think that investing in childcare will not only reduce the burden on women, but it will ease a big constraint in urban India. In rural India, I think the problem is not so much childcare. The problem is really of non-availability of jobs, right? And even the jobs that are there, like Asha Anganwadi and ANMs, which are completely done by women, the remuneration is extremely low. These are very high risk jobs, as we saw during the COVID time. Also, these we realize the importance of these three kinds of personnel, because these were the three categories of workers that were doing contact tracing, that were doing disseminating information, that were making sure that people were, being directed to health facilities, etc. So they were the primary point of contact in the healthcare system. Going to doctors, etc., is a much later stage. It's the first stage is really getting in touch with these three individuals, and you see the abysmally low remuneration that these three categories of women receive. So these are in principle government jobs, but their remuneration is nowhere near what a typical government servant would get for being, in a government job. So I think we need to recognize the critical importance of these positions. We also need to recognize the fact that in rural India, there is a very large segment of educated women, educated up to different levels of education, and by the way, which has been increasing. So we need to recognize that, who are willing to work in a variety of roles, who have capabilities, that go only beyond just not setting up a beauty parlor. Because, when you talk about the skilling initiatives for women, often the focus is on very stereotypically feminine occupations like beauty parlors, etc., etc. But not all women want to run beauty parlors. And how many beauty parlors can there be in a village, right? Even if all women wanted to run beauty parlors. So I think that we need, when we think of women's labor force participation, we have to recognize that their productive capacity is tremendous. And I think India is losing out on its GDP because of the underutilization of the human capital that half of its population represents, which is women. And so I think even if we did not have the goal of gender equality, we would still want to invest in using women's productive capability. But of course, we care about gender equality, not just because of the SDGs, but we care about it as an intrinsic objective. And so I think we need to invest in the ability of women to participate in productive paid work that is commensurate with their skills, that's commensurate with their aspirations, that's commensurate with their with what they're capable of, right? Now, to give you an example of women's preparedness, when you look at the self-help group, the NRLM, the National Rural Livelihoods Mission Program, and the self-help group mobilization, I just did a big study for the World Bank, looking at the 20 years of the SHG movement. More than 74 million women have been mobilized in SHGs. This is greater than the combined population of Australia and Canada. And these are women who come out of their houses once a week, meet in these meetings. This is very small level of economic work, but it shows that women are willing to be mobilized and do something which is over and above their household chores. These are very poor, vulnerable women. They battle, even attending an SHG meeting is a huge cost for them, right? Because it takes away time from something else that they need to be doing. And if we can mobilize women into SHGs, I just don't, I believe very much that they will join paid work if paid work was made available to them, right? Then there are other issues like transportation. So sometimes they might be work in the district center, they might be work in the taluka center. But how is a woman going to go from her house to the taluka center? How is a woman going to go from her house to the district center? There is a huge responsibility of domestic chores. I don't only mean care work, but just cooking, cleaning, fetching water, fetching fuel. So things that we may not even consider gendered interventions actually might affect women very positively. So for example, if there was a pipe water into every household in rural India, right? You may not think of it as a gendered intervention, but it will hugely decrease the workload of women who have to spend hours fetching the water because of the social norm where that women have to do this work, not men, and things like that. So I think that we need to expand the kinds of measures that we typically think of when we think of women. It's not only a matter of skilling women into stereotypically feminine occupations. Recognize where the women are working and remunerate them adequately, whether they are, doing the work through SHGs or whether they are Asha Anganwadi workers or school teachers or, any of these occupations. And recognize that NREGA and Asha Anganwadi, these are not the only two sectors in which women can work. They can do much more. And in urban India, the problems are a little bit different. Childcare is much more important in urban India. Transportation is much more important in urban India. And safety, which typically is meant to be seen, okay, we will have CCTV cameras everywhere. Women should not be out of their homes after 8 p.m., etc. I think, and streets should be cleared of, hawkers, etc. Nobody should be on the street. I think that's the opposite of what needs to be done. The more the number of people are on the street, the safer the streets will become. So we have to encourage a culture of pedestrian culture where pavements are full of people. Lonely streets are unsafe. Streets that are populated are safe. You look at any big city in the world, London, New York, Paris, cities that have a culture of people walking on the streets, street food, and things like that. Those are the spaces that are safer for women. And unfortunately, when we talk of women's safety, we say, oh, remove everybody, remove the hawkers, remove everybody, and empty the streets of its people. So encouraging public transportation, having pavements, make street lights, making it possible for people to walk on the streets, encouraging that culture of walking rather than private transportation, etc. These are all interventions that would come together to produce greater conditions that would enable greater participation of women in productive work. And so I think that when we think of women's gender gaps in productive work, which COVID has worsened, but they already existed, so we cannot blame only COVID for that situation. I think we need to take a holistic picture, recognize women as intelligent, capable adults who need not be pigeonholed into beauty parlor assistants only. They can do much more than if somebody wants to be a beauty parlor assistant, all power to them. But if somebody wants to be a mathematics researcher, that woman should also be allowed, that not that she's not allowed, but there should be conditions created where she can realize her dreams, right? And so when we think about Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, बेटी पढ़ती है तो उसकी उम्मीद भी जगती है. And so, we need to recognize that Beti Padhao will lead to greater aspirations. And we need to find as a society interventions that will fulfill those ambitions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Deshpande. I would change the pattern that we have been following so far. We used to take questions at the end of the panel discussion. Like, I'm seeing the way that we are going, I think it's better that we change the pattern and take some questions at this stage. Later, if some questions come up, we can always supplement them. So I would open the floor and request our participants if they have any question to Professor Deshpande. Of course, she has pointed to many important issues. I think one major issue is that we cannot blame COVID for the gender gaps that already existed, maybe deepened or exposed or whatever, but definitely not the sole cause of the gender gaps. And there are many things that we need to learn from the experiences that she has pointed. And of course, we will document whatever you have said today, and we'll bring out our proceeding later on. But right now, if there are any questions to Professor Deshpande, you may please unmute yourself and ask, or you can drop it in the chat box. We will ask it on your behalf, or you can raise hand and we will unmute you. The floor is now open.
I think, Ruchira, everybody is convinced by what I'm saying. So
Right.
I managed to convince
Definitely.
everyone.
Yes, and I think it also takes a little time to process and then come up with the
That's
questions.
okay. That's fine.
That's
That's
what
fine.
we see.
You can convey the questions to me later on also.
Yes,
That's
sure.
yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Deshpande. And of course, we will come back to you with more of our. I think there is already a question in the chat box. Let me take the opportunity to ask you. Ms. Veena is asking that how can we handle the socio-cultural factors that contribute to gender gap? Okay. Would you like to take that question? Because I think the question is more to the society than
Yeah,
to
it's a
scholar.
very broad question, but to give a very one-line answer, social cultural norms change in every society. In India also they have changed, right? And so the question is how do norms change? Even when you look at the developed countries today, their norms today that you see today are not the same as they were 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Women were not in the labor force as much as they are today. So what were the factors that contributed to those norms? How did women get into the labor force? Or did the norms change first and then women got into the labor force? Or did women get into the labor force and that contributed to a change in norms? My reading of the history is that when conditions change, material conditions change, then that sets the stage for norms changing. As more and more women will get into the labor force, that will compel people to re-examine their beliefs And there will always be some people who may not re-examine, and that happens in every society. Even in the developed countries, you find people with very rigid views about, position of women, etc. But equally, overall, there's a much greater acceptance of women being in the public space, right? And I think that the fact that women entered paid employment contributed to that. As there are more and more women, so think about in a very practical sense, right? Supposing there is no woman in an organization, and you say, okay, we want female friendly workplace. For that employer, female friendly workplace is not even an issue because there is no woman. So he or she is not going to be compelled to create a female friendly workplace. So, but supposing there are the 5 or 6 women start working there, they might demand a separate toilet. They might demand a little room where they can sit. So the entry of women into that workplace will gradually start, will pave the way for a more female friendly workplace, rather than say first institute female friendly, because it's a hypothetical question. The employers will say, well, there are no women in my organization. So, or suppose, let me give you another example. Supposing, it's a corporate setting and the boss, it's all men, and all the people after the work is over, they go to a bar or they go to a restaurant, they have an evening, or they play golf together, etc., etc. And a lot of the decisions that should be taken in the office get taken in this informal setting, right? Now you say, okay, no, that's not a right way to do it. But the boss will say, well, why not? All my employees are with me. It's a small setting. We're all chatting. And supposing one woman enters and she's not able to go in the evening, or she doesn't want to go in the evening, but the work culture continues, that would be a problem. But if there's a critical mass of women, they will be able to insist that no decision taken in an informal setting is a valid decision. It has to be in the office. It has to be where everybody can participate. But how will that change happen? That will happen when there is a critical mass of women in the organization. So socio-cultural factors do change. But what leads the change? Where does the cycle get broken? I think that's my point. And the point that I'm making is that when greater number of women enter paid employment, and that we have to enable through policy, then gradually socio-cultural norms will start to change. It's not easy. It's not automatic. It's very challenging, and no country in the world has actually fully changed it. So patriarchal norms exist in all countries, but with differing strictness. And so I think it's a process. It's not a 0-1 situation. Right? Patriarchy has not ended anywhere. Yeah.
So there are a few more questions that have come up. One is from Dr. Surjit Vikraman, who is asking that how do you think caste interplays with the existing gender disparities? What is your impression about this during the COVID crisis? And Dr. Akanksha Shukla is asking that in your discourse you pointed that I'm sorry, I cannot read.
Creche may not be a requirement in rural
May not
areas.
be a requirement in rural areas. Studies show there are declining trends of joint families. What is the possible
Yeah,
solution?
I'm not saying creche is not required in rural. Sorry, if that's what you misunderstood, then that's not what I was saying at all. I was saying that creches are important everywhere, in rural and in urban India. And I even said that in rural India, you find women, with the children playing, which is not an ideal situation, which means you do need a creche. But my point was that in urban India, a woman will be unable to go to work if there is zero. She cannot at all go to work if there is nobody to mind her child. In rural India, it's not an ideal situation, but a woman in principle can take the child to a farm and work there, which is not ideal. So you do need a creche. So, just to clarify that. Changing the mindset, that's what I'm trying to say. How will the mindset change? We can't wait for the mindset to change first. The mindset might take 100 years, 200 years, 500 years to change. I'm saying the mindset starts to change when women start getting involved in paid work. I'm not disputing that mindset needs to change. All I'm saying is what will push the mindset change process. Right?
There is one more question on is there
about the caste thing. Yeah, I didn't go into that because it's a more complicated conversation. But the castes that are lower in socioeconomic ranking, they typically have higher labor force participation rates of women because there are fewer taboos on women working, and the notions of
Good work and
private space, what gender equality, etc., are also different. But these are the sections that have seen the biggest decline in labor force participation rates, which suggests to us that work has become more fractured, more discontinued, not available on a continuous basis. And so I think that needs to. So I think availability of jobs in rural India and in urban India is an issue. But I was talking about other things as well. Self-defense. Yeah, sure. Women should be trained in self-defense, but why not focus more on making spaces safe for, why must I'm happy to be trained in defending myself if somebody attacks me, but why don't we work towards a society where the probability of me getting attacked is low, rather than saying, if you get attacked, this is what you should do, right? Why don't we create a society where women are not attacked for being in public spaces?
Right.
That's
Thank you so much, Professor Deshpande. I think the questions are slowly kind of digressing from the issue hand and going towards some other discussion. So I will just wind up the discussion here. You have pointed to several important aspects related to the labor market and the gender nuances in it. And I think we have heard about how there are some differences in urban and rural India in how these gender differences are created, and the practical interventions such as something that will benefit everyone also can help in mitigating some of the gender challenges. So with those, we would like to thank you for your time and for your presentation. And if there are more questions, we can always convey it to you at the end, and we can connect you to the people who are more interested in working with you in the future as well. We would now like to move on to our next speaker and welcome Dr. KG Sandhya, who is with us. Dr. Sandhya, am I audible to you?
Yes, Ruchira.
Yeah, welcome, Dr. Sandhya. For our participants, Dr. KG Sandhya is a senior associate. She is based in Population Council, New Delhi. She conducts research on strategies to improve adolescent girls' reproductive and sexual health and on development, gender-based violence, and maternal health. Dr. Sandhya is also involved in activities to strengthen the capacity of researchers and program implementers. Sandhya has extensive experiences designing and conducting rigorous qualitative and quantitative studies on the rights of youth, gender equity, reproductive health, and gender-based violence. She has published many book chapters, international peer-reviewed journal articles, and study reports. In 2000, Sandhya received the postdoctoral fellowship from Population Council in New Delhi. She became a program officer, then a senior program officer in 2004, an associate of Forsberg in 2009, and associate 2 in 2012. She serves on the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population Panel on Reproductive Health and is an elected member of the Asian Population Association Council. She holds a PhD in Population Studies from Flinders University in Adelaide, Australia. Thank you for your time, Sandhya. I know you're very busy and you have agreed to still be with us and share your insights from the Udaya project, I believe, which you will be sharing with us today. So without much delay, I would like to hand over the mic to you. Over to you, Sandhya.
Thank you, Ruchira, for inviting me to this webinar. It was fascinating to hear from the Director General plus Professor Deshpande, and I was taking copious notes of the points both of them have raised. And so I'm going to talk about, some insights, how transition to adulthood remains gendered in India. But before I speak from the study that Ruchira referred, that I will be sharing details, I'd like to spare a minute to highlight the importance of investing during adolescence for reducing gender inequalities. I wanted to borrow from the 2018 World Bank study on the cost of gender inequality, which says that while gender inequality impacts women throughout their life, but its effects are especially detrimental in adolescence. and that programs aiming to reduce gender inequality through investment in adolescent girls are especially likely to have a higher return for a number of reasons. One, earlier investments tend to bear fruits that persist throughout a woman's life for many years afterwards. Second, the cost of interventions in adolescence, or in some cases even earlier, even in childhood, tend to have a lower cost than the cost of interventions implemented later in life. And the third reason is that at a formative age, interventions may be more successful in influencing values and behaviors. Later in life, it may become more difficult for girls and women to fully benefit from new opportunities provided to them. So adolescence is a crucial time during which investments may yield the highest returns and can contribute to address the gender inequality that we speak today. So adolescents are a unique and an important group. As per the 2020 population projection, we have about 242 million adolescents in India, down from 253 million a decade ago as per the 2011 census. 1 in 5 adolescents in the world is an Indian, and 1 in every 5 person in the country is an adolescent. I already mentioned the importance of investing in adolescents. They are a unique group. They are in a formative phase of the human development with unique needs. They bear a substantial share of the global disease and injury burden. At the same time, investing in the health of adolescents have triple dividend for the health benefits of the adolescents right now, in their future as adults, and the next generation they will bear. And it also reduces the present and future cost and enhances social capital. And most importantly, it's a fundamental right to life, development, and health. And we have made a lot of commitments to addressing the adolescent needs, both in the health sector and also in the development sector. And improving the situation of adolescents is critical to the country's achievement of several SDGs, most importantly, SDG 3, 4, and 5. And extent to which we realize these goals depends on our investment and how adolescents make advantage of our investments in adolescents. So in today's presentation, I would like to talk about where do girls and boys stand with regard to access to resources and opportunities, and what happens if girls and boys get off the track early on, and what helps girls and boys make a healthy transition. I'm going to draw data from the National Family Health Survey 2015-16 and 2019-20, as well as the Udaya longitudinal study of adolescents in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh that the Population Council has been undertaking for the last 6 years, and to which Ruchira referred. Just have a bit of a trouble. Okay. So where do adolescents, boys and girls, stand in terms of access to resources and opportunities? This is from the Udaya study that the Population Council has been doing in the state of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. This is, I would say, the first ever state representative longitudinal study of adolescents' transitions in India. And we see that there has been, progress in reducing gender inequality in many respects, but at the same time, they persist. If you look at the proportion of boys and girls who are currently in school or college, we still have more boys than girls who are in school. The blue thing in this graph is referring to the status of boys, and the green is the status of the girls. And they are learning, the numeracy levels are higher among boys than among girls. In terms of literacy levels, the gap is not as wide as in the case of numeracy. But the inequality is much more prominent in terms of the proportion of adolescent girls and boys who engage in paid work or who have access to the digital media or who access the digital media regularly. I could talk about many more instances where we see that the boys have an urge over girls in these two states. And this is not a pattern that we see just in these two states. We see that in other parts of the country also. I know this is a crowded slide, but want to talk about how life course transition, the transition from adolescence to adulthood, remains gendered. And we are looking at how the situation, what is the status of the adolescent at each ages, from ages 10 to 22, in terms of schooling, work, marriage, childbearing status, according to their status at the last birthday in these two states. And what we see, I want to highlight the status at the age of 20, which is, we typically consider as the transition point from adolescence into young adulthood. And at the age of 20, the numbers are not there, but I'm just picking those numbers for your information. We see that about 47% of boys were attending school or college, compared to 41% of girls. 20% of the boys combine studies with work, and 44% of out-of-school boys were working. Again, we see, and we heard from Professor Deshpande's speech, that, the differences in the labor force participation. And we see that same pattern among adolescent boys and girls. Much fewer girls combine studies with work, or if they are out of school also, much fewer girls are working. At the age of 20, about 1% of in-school boys were married and 8% of out-of-school boys were married. And many more, particularly the out-of-school girls, were married by that age. 3% of the in-school girls and 19% of the out-of-school girls, compared to 8% of the out-of-school boys. And by that age, we also see that about 9% of out-of-school girls were already mothers. So in a nutshell, what we see is that the transition from adolescence to adulthood remains gendered. And from that perspective from UP and Bihar, I just want to share what we see nationally in terms of one of the key transitions, which is the transition to marriage, and which we know that for many happens in childhood. Now there is the talk about, making the legal age at marriage equal for both boys and girls at the age of 21. And in this slide, I wanted to highlight, what has been our achievement in reducing early child marriage among girls. So comparing evidence from the NFHS for in 2015-16 and the most recent NFHS 2019-21. These are district level prevalences of child marriage among girls for about 572 districts for which we have comparable information from both these rounds. Nationally, we see that almost 1 out of 4 young women aged 20 to 24 were married before age 18. The national statistics, hides a lot of divergence at the state and the district level in terms of the prevalences. Out of the 572 districts, 429 recorded a decline. Even in terms of the proportion or the pace of the decline, we see wide variety. In about 148 districts, there was a decline of 5 to 10 percentage points. And in 95 districts, there's a more than 10 percentage point decline. But it's not declining everywhere. We also see that there are about 143 districts across India that recorded an increase in the prevalence of child marriage among girls. And in about 25 districts, the increase was in the extent of 5 to 10 percentage points. And in 8 districts, it was more than 10 percentage point increase. And when we talk about child marriage, our attention for obvious reasons is among child marriage among females. But at the same time, the data shows that there is prevalence of early marriage or marriage before the legal minimum age of 21 among boys too. In fact, almost 1 in 5 young men were married before the legal minimum age of 21 in 2019-21. And it is as high as 25% of young men in states like Bihar, Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Madhya Pradesh. And correspondingly, we see also that is teenage pregnancy. Just as child marriage is declining, we see some decline in child marriage in the teenage pregnancy, but not as dramatic as what we have seen in the case of child marriage. So about 7% of girls aged 15 to 19 are already mothers or pregnant in 2019-21. This translates into about 4 million teenage mothers. Again, there is a significant district-wise variation in the country. So there are about 383 districts which recorded a decline, while 189 recorded an increase in the prevalence of teenage pregnancy. That brings me to the topic of the contraceptive use among married adolescent girls. When you compare the NFHS 4 and 5, we see there is an increasing trend in all states for which we have this data out in the public domain, except in Kerala. You also see that there is an increased use of traditional methods among adolescent girls in several states like Bihar, Gujarat, Himachal Pradesh, and northern states. The female or the disadvantage that adolescent girls face is not restricted to the domain of sexual and reproductive health. These findings are from the Udaya study, and we see that mental health is at another domain we see the female disadvantage, or females sharing more disease burden. As you can see from this slide, at any of these ages, more females than males have reported symptoms suggestive of moderate to severe depressions in the 2 weeks preceding the interview. And among females, we have also seen that married adolescent girls, are more at risk of reporting poor mental health condition. And when we probe about the reasons, we often hear that it's related with the gender expectations from girls to become a mother. So married girls who have a delayed pregnancy, who experience difficulty in conceiving, who experience abortion, they are more likely to be reporting, symptoms of depression. Another manifestation, which is the violence, the extreme manifestation of the gender practices, marital violence. That is also an important risk factor that places married girls at risk of poor mental health condition. And here are some statistics from the Udaya study about, violence experienced by married girls. We found that a large proportion of adolescent boys and girls grew up in families where, witnessing parental violence is normal, experiencing violence at the hands of the parents is normal. And so it's not surprising that, that sense of norms around violence transcend into perpetration in a relationship, whether we are talking about relationship within marriage or outside marriage. When we look at, the two waves of the Udaya study, we see that the proportion of girls who experience physical violence in the last 12 months, in fact, has increased from 22% to 37%. The proportion who reported sexual violence were pretty same. And another form of violence that now gets documented increasingly is the cyber-based harassment. With increased access to mobile phones and internet, we see that mobile phone or internet-based harassment is also taking place. Again, I mean, it affects both boys and girls, but you can see that more girls than boys reported such harassment between the two waves of the study. It's true that the gender differences is, in terms of educational access is reducing, but still we see that when you look at secondary school completion, more boys complete, at least some parts of India. You will see a reverse pattern in some of the other states too. And on the right side, I'm sharing the data on boys and girls with 8 years of education who are assessed to be numerate and literate. I mean, first of all, it is a saddening situation to see that even adolescents who have completed grade 12, less than 4 out of 5 of them were assessed to be numerate and literate. And there is a huge difference between boys and girls. Far fewer girls were assessed to be numerate and literate. And it is visible across all grades, whether we are looking at grade 8 or grade 12. This is, we already heard the gender difference. And among the boys and girls, you see that, at the age of 22, in our sample in this states represented sample in Bihar and UP, about 72% of the boys were working for pay compared to 32%. And job seeking has increased both among boys and girls, but obviously more among boys. So what happens if the adolescent goes off the track at age 15? And when I say going off the track or be on the track, I mean at the age they remain in school, they remain unmarried, and they are not working. They focus more on skill acquisition or strengthening their capabilities. This is the findings based on regression-based analysis of boys and girls who are age 15 and above and unmarried at wave 1. And in the regression, we have control for such covariates as household wealth, the place of residence, the caste, religion, mother's education, and the state. And we compared boys and girls who were on track and against those who have gone off track by different categories, like being in school and married and working, out of school and married and working, out of school and married, not working, and for girls, out of school and married. And this is the status when they were in the wave 1 in 2015-16, and then we looked at what is the status 3 years later. And you would see that there's a lot of white space or blank space for boys, and more information for girls. And we see both boys and girls who goes off the track at age 15 are likely to perform poorly on numeracy and literacy, more so among girls. They are more likely to work for pay. And among girls, they are more likely to be thin. They are likely to report symptoms suggestive of moderate to severe depression in the 2 weeks prior to the interview. They are less likely to report current use of contraception and more likely to report experience of marital violence. So what helps adolescents to make a healthy transition or to keep, be on track, kind of? We looked at our data to see what has been enabling factors. One critical area of investment is keeping adolescents in school. With an additional year of schooling, we see the odds of child marriage reduced by about 88 percentage points. Spousal violence reduced by 5 percentage points. And foundational skills increased by 4 percentage points. And we also see that entitlements in the school settings, for example, in the form of scholarships and bicycle schemes, helps. There's a higher chance of completing grade 10. And this is something, other evaluations have also shown. Supplementary coaching helps to keep adolescents in school. With the supplementary coaching, the hazard of dropping out from school before completing grade 10 is lower by almost 0.6, 0.7. And regular attendance is important. We see again, the hazard of dropping out is lower for those children who are, able to attend regularly. And we know that, there is a gender difference in regular attendance too. And entering school at the right age is important. Those who enter school at the right age are less likely to drop out from school before completing grade 10. Building vocational skills is another area of intervention that we found effective in terms of promoting labor force participation as adolescent girls transition from adolescence to young adulthood. And enabling interactions between adolescents and the frontline workers helps. But unfortunately, the interactions with the adolescents and frontline workers is limited, and also is conditioned by the status, especially in terms of the marital status of adolescents. You see that it's about 25% of the unmarried girls reported interactions with a health worker in the year preceding the interview in their wave 2, compared to more than 60% of married girls. And that also reflects the gendered notions that our frontline workers have. They don't reach out to girls unless they are, married, unless they are in the family formation, stage. And we feel that that interaction has to happen much earlier. But the positive thing is that such interactions helps in terms of, receiving appropriate health care. It also even helps in terms of increasing the agency of adolescent girls. And adolescent specific programs also have positive effects. For example, girls who attended adolescent specific programs like family life education or school health program, or even the adolescent health days, we see that are more 12 percentage points more likely to express gender egalitarian views, and they had a lower odds of getting married before age 18. Here again, the challenge is that we have these programs, but the reach remains limited. I mean, in our study, we found that no more than 1 in 3 adolescents had participated in these programs. Promoting egalitarian gender norms early on. I mean, in the earlier speech also there were comments about how do we change mindset, whether it is in terms of promoting norms that encourages women's labor force participation or others. I think one solution is that we need to invest in changing the beliefs of children and adolescents, and the earlier that happens, it's more easier to change. And promoting such positive norms have a lot of ripple effect, positive downstream effects, both in terms of delaying marriage, enabling them to exercise choice in spouse selection, delaying childbearing, reducing marital violence, and use of reproductive health services. And finally, the expanding use of digital media. With the COVID outbreak, we have seen that access to the technology have increased, but we know it still remains gendered. More boys own a phone. More boys have, can use a mobile phone than girls. But at the same time, the ones who have access, we see their chances of, seeking services or demonstrating agency in their family level is higher for those who have, those kind of access to these modern technologies. So what does this study key takeaways? Obviously, there's advantage in increasing the investment in adolescents. We need to ensure that the adolescents do not go off track early. At the same time, for a variety of reasons, there will be adolescents who will go off track. And so we need to target those from a disadvantaged groups. There was a question about, how, caste intersects on the inequality. I'm not presented, but when you look at, how the transitions differs, we see that these socio-economic disadvantages intersects with gender, and the adolescents from these groups are much more vulnerable than the ones who are from privileged groups. And we also need to increase the reach of existing adolescent-specific life skills and health programs. We have school health program to ensure that the frontline workers reach out to adolescent boys and girls. These findings also calls for promoting gender transformative programs, and there are, evidence-based gender transformative programs, not only focusing on girls but also on boys, which does have, diffusion effect. And that takes me to my last point about, addressing gender issues. Obvious, for resource reasons, we have been traditionally focusing on girls and women. We need to expand and explore more ways to understand what works to keep boys on track too. So with that, let me stop. Thank you once again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Sandhya. Thank you for your expansive and very comprehensive presentation. We will, of course, collate the outcome of these webinars that we are having. And while we do that, we'll again come back to our speakers. Let me straight away invite our next speaker because we are losing out on time. And we will take the questions at the end of the webinar now. Professor Lekha Chakraborty, are you here? Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So we will take the questions later.
Yeah, so we will take the questions together at the end of the webinar and we can move on to our next presentation. Now, thank you, Sandhya. We'll come back to you once the question answer starts. And let me introduce Professor Lekha Chakraborty to those present here. Professor Lekha is a pioneer economist in institutionalizing gender budgeting in India. She is a professor in NIPFP Delhi, and she has done the work on gender budgeting at this very initial stage with Chief Economic Advisor, Minister of Finance, Government of India in 2004. Professor Lekha is also affiliated as research associate with the Levi Economics Institute of Bard College in New York. She is an elected board member of Governing Council of International Institute of Public Finance in Munich. Her work focuses on macroeconomics of public finance, fiscal federalism, extractive sector economics, financing human development, and gender budgeting. She is the recipient of Infosys Best PhD Thesis Award from Indian Institute of Sciences, Bangalore. She has authored many books and articles. Of course, you have come across her work in EPW regularly. Her book, The Fiscal Consolidation, Budget Deficits and Macroeconomy, received endorsement reviews from former RBI Governor Y.V. Reddy and IMF Executive Director, Fiscal Affairs, Professor Vito Tanzi. She has worked for the IMF, World Bank, UNESCAP, UNDP, UN Women, and the Commonwealth Secretariat on short stints. Her work experience on macro-fiscal policy and human development spans across 7 countries: Sweden, Canada, Morocco, the Philippines, South Africa, Sri Lanka, and Mexico, and she has worked more frequently in the Asia-Pacific region. She has twice an awardee of Shastri Indo-Canada Program for Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Government of Canada. She was a visiting professor at American University in Uppsala University, Sweden, Carleton University, Canada, and University of Utah, US. She is a columnist in the Financial Express, in Business Line, Business Standard, The Wire, Hindustan Times, and The Scroll, featured in CNBC, ANI, DD News, Air World Air Services, and Rajya Sabha. We are honored to have her here in this session, talk about gender budgeting experiences from India. Over to you, Professor Lekha.
Thank you, Ruchira, for this opportunity. Director General, he has preempted a part of my talk because he was beautifully talking about the journey of gender budgeting, what we have achieved and what we have not. So let me, somebody's calling. What happened? Everything is fine? Okay. As Director General mentioned, gender budgeting. Am I audible, Ruchira?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. As he mentioned, gender budgeting, it began as a fiscal innovation. But over the years, what we achieved and what we could not achieve, I think this is the right time to take that, inventory. Because, in the time of pandemic, such an effective public financial management tool like gender budgeting, that space needs to be used beyond the energy infrastructure. Because if you look at the pandemic packages, what is energy in the gender neutral ministry like petroleum? We have introduced that fuel, giving fuel to the poor women in the households. That's fine, but in the pandemic packages, nothing beyond that has happened in terms of gender budgeting. So where we can go from here, that is what we need to look into. And as Ashwini pointed out, there is a element in the public policy to use these tools as a tools of social justice. So how can we use gender budgeting as a tool of social justice? That has not yet been, explored to the full potential. For instance, in the Bill of Rights, Justice Verma Committee recommendations in the Bill of Rights, there are a lot of, capabilities which were narrated, but those kind of capabilities, in order to make it happen, we need to back it up with budgetary allocations. But those budgetary allocations and the link between, that Bill of Rights commitments and the budgetary commitments, that has not happened. But I can understand that Director General was that time Secretary in Social Justice. That's what he mentioned right now. I think in Delhi government, there was an attempt to translate the Bill of Rights into budgetary commitments, but that was also not a sustainable process. So this we need to explore further, how we can use it as a medium or a tool of social justice. Second is gender budgeting. It is at the macro level and also at the micro level from ex-ante processes. So what is happening right now, we are applying a gender lens to whatever happened, existing budgets and looking into it. So maybe we can start looking into ex-ante processes and focus on decentralized levels. And, at the local level, if we focus on the gender budgeting initiatives, we will be able to achieve much more than at the macro level. But when I say this, I understand that this process began as a macro exercise because gender is not alone a micro concern. Gender is a macro question. So that time it was a revolutionary thing when we spoke about gender as macro. But that's the way we began. But to tie the both ends, I think we need to strengthen gender budgeting at the local level. I will give you a few examples based on my field level experiences. One is, let us talk about financial inclusion. Only very recently, government started talking about the digital infrastructure and access of women to the financial infrastructure or the financial inclusion. But before that, we thought, whatever happened in terms of reducing the cost of credit, women will be comfortable, and monetary policy and financial policy can do that. But through empirical evidence, we understood that it is not the cost of credit that is matter. More for women, it is the access to credit. Because, Ashwini mentioned about the self-help group initiatives. A lot of women came out of the house and joined this self-help group initiatives. But in the process, overnight, we were unable to make women micro entrepreneurs. But they came out, that led to social empowerment, but not financial empowerment. And access to banking sector, that was a partial story, because the model was you collect the savings potential of women, collect it in the self-help group, and self-help group open a bank account, and that's the way women can access bank. Otherwise, poor women were perceived as unbankable clients. So maybe this digital revolution or this digital infrastructure and access to the banking sector, that is corrected to a certain extent of women being looked upon as unbankable clients. So access is now there, but of course there are many issues. It's not only opening a bank account, whether she's able to do credit related or economic activity related things, or whether her account is zero balance. Those are important questions. But when compared to the earlier peer monitoring model, that she has to come up and form a group, and she will be doing a peer monitoring model for her activity, and that self-help group will open an account in the bank and deposit those kinds of things. That is a peer monitoring model, because she doesn't have any collateral asset. The moment you have to open a bank account, you will be asked for collateral. So those things are partially solved the moment we talk about access to credit through this digital infrastructure. Now, savings. Transaction cost is of course reduced the moment you collect everything in the self-help groups. But those savings, whether she is able to mobilize that or translate that into economic activity related instrument, that question is also very crucial, because the way that model function was that whatever the savings self-help group does, what bank will do is they will put equivalent amount into that self-help group, and they can go for an economic activity, and if they generate some income, they will do some credit rating activity, and then if that self-help group is ready for the next level, then they will do a 1:1 credit infusion. So see, this is such a cumbersome process, and through this women may or may not become micro entrepreneurs. The way they maintain their finance accounts, that itself may not make them eligible to get into the next level of that credit rating when the bankers come and do. So those kinds of things doesn't make her an entrepreneur overnight. But what has happened is, as Ashwini rightly pointed out, when women came out, that itself is a big decision. They are coming out from home and they are together. So that social capital and that social networking, and that made social empowerment to them, but not financial empowerment, because we need to work a lot regarding this financial empowerment. Now let's do the same financial inclusion model with men. What has happened to the men-led self-help groups? They have done credit layering, in the sense whatever money bank has given to these boys, they did some kind of credit layering, means they, without any activity, economic activity, this money was given to his friends or relatives or peer groups, and through that they were trying to collect little bit of a high interest rate. It's not exactly a Ponzi game, but then credit layering, they take suppose from 1% interest rate, but they are lending for 2% interest rate, then they can go back and do the repayment. Very cool. So they were doing this credit layering without creating any business. So these are moments which we always look into trust models, but this may not be a trust-based model, because it's a breach of trust that they are not doing anything. But the moment we look into the repayment statistics, they repay. Men repay, women repay. But what is the source of repayment? That is another source of gender tension, because women may be taking money from the bank. She may not be a defaulter. 100% she's paying back. But in between, what is happening? Who is using the money? Who is under pressure to pay that money back? These intra-household tensions we are unable to capture. So when public policy support a woman, there are many other nuances which are happening, which prevent us to understand what are the channels in which again it is leading to intra-household tension, or whether she's getting empowered in the process when a public policy is supporting her. So this is also, we need to go for an evaluation, because the main point about gender budgeting is it is a public policy. When state machinery supports women, they became empowered, they became more safe and secure. So this is an assumption, but there are little bit of story in between here and there. that public policy supporting women doing well, but in between, what's happening? This is one example. Second example, let's go to the village in Orissa, a weaving-based village. And that is their strength, that is their inner skill, that they know world-class weaving. So when there was, when government came up with employer of last resort policy, that is not a gender budgeting policy, it's employer of last resort. When everything else failed, government guaranteeing jobs to people. But why women were not coming out and accessing that employer of last resort policies? What was that gender budgeting, in between this women, accessing that employer of last resort? What was happening was that employment of last resort policies were based on women's access to the public works, but women may not be willing to go for taking up the public works or non-farm employment. So their skill or inner strength or their inner talent may be something else. Maybe in that village, weaving may be the thing. So we need to revive that. But when it comes to the employer of last resort, when the menu of the activities was fixed and when it was predominantly public works, those kind of things which women could do, they have talents to do something, world-class ability to do weaving, but they were forced to take up something else because we didn't feel what was that missing in this scheme of job guarantee. Because if you ask any heterodox economist, she or he will come up with the solution for poverty or solution for a lack of economic development. She or he will just announce we will go for an employer of last resort policy. That's like a silver bullet. But women are not able to come and access it. So what are those complementary fiscal policies absent? We need to check. And I can tell you a parallel example from the what you call as communes, just like our villages. It's communes of Philippines. We went for a field work there in one village named Sosagan. And there, when the counselor was asking the people, it was like a consultative process. What exactly gender budgeting for you? What exactly you want to do when a state missionary is going to support you by giving you money and giving you space to plan your things? So one male, participant, he came up with the idea that we will do gender budgeting in agriculture because I could decipher an issue over there related to gender. So what was it? We revamped irrigation. We will go for more investment in agriculture. And what is it, gender budgeting? Because in Philippines, you can understand from the data, you have seen that many women from the villages go to urban centers and also to abroad as nannies to take care of others' children. So that is creating that absence of a mother in own home is creating a lot of social, economic issues. And how to prevent women leaving that village? What could be the gender budgeting? So they revamp irrigation, they strengthen the investment in the agriculture sector so that more employment could be generated for women over there. And they try to prevent women moving from the villages, their own homes, to urban, because care providers home, that also it's coming up as another important study, because women as care providers, that is of course an opportunity, but the care provider's home, what's happening to that when she moved out of her home as a care provider? So how can we prevent that and put her back to her own roots and let her work? So this is also gender budgeting. So Atmanirbhar Bharat, we understand that it has got bad connotation and good connotation. But what is this Atmanirbhar policies in the context of gender budgeting? What we can think. One is this example I mentioned about weaving. What she can do, we need to revive that instead of what she can't do. So maybe these kind of examples may be good examples, but I'm not talking about any protectionism or anything. But these are some good examples which we can highlight. Another example is, a doctor was a counselor of another commune, and she wants to reduce maternal mortality rate in her village to 0. What could be the gender budgeting which is required to reduce the maternal mortality rate to zero in that commune. So then, it was understood that it is not a technological revolution that is required to make that maternal mortality zero, because we know that British journal article of 3 delay model. One is women has to perceive that she's feeling ill and she needs to communicate it to her close male relative. That is delay number one. And there is usually it takes long time because interpreting her own problems, that's a huge concern. We talk about satellite medicine and all, but women do not know to interpret her disease or her illness. She can't. So that is delay number one. Second is when she communicate, what is the time taken for that male or relative or a close female relative to take her to the hospital? Then physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, all this comes over there. Then the third is whether the facility she's getting in that place, whether doctors are available, whether sisters are available. So this is 3 delay model. So gender budgeting can help in these 3 levels. May not be in the first level that she communicate, but gender budgeting, how it can help means if she's if we can strengthen the agency in her by making her participate in the government related programs, she come out of the home. When that agency in her is strengthened through her participating in some other activities, that's the only thing in which she can be empowered and she can go for a communication about her own problems. So that is one thing. So there are different ways in which, so usually people ask what is gender in infrastructure. This is gender in infrastructure because if her infrastructure is good, she will not die. Her process of getting to the hospital may be faster. So infrastructure cannot be treated as gender neutral. So this is another example. But I would also like to highlight the Nobel laureate Duflo and Chattopadhyay has conducted an experiment in India, but that is not gender budgeting, because to immunization, to increase the immunization rate, the experiment done by Duflo is in her controlled experiment. In some camps, she provided lentils. In some camps, not providing lentils. But women responded to the camps where lentils were provided. But is that lentil provisioning is gender budgeting? Because it can just be a short-term policy. You cannot incentivize a woman by giving dal and ask her to come her children to get her children immunized. So that is why randomized controlled experiments, the way they perceive the development issues of our country, that was flawed. It is not only a methodological flaw, but how they perceive the experiments also flawed. And of course, when you control, in terms of nutrition of the children, how you control, you will not provide eggs or you will not provide milk to the children if you want to study that. How do you control? So these are ethical or unethical. So these are issues related to the randomized control experiments and whether it is child budgeting or gender budgeting. What are the policy inferences you get from those experiments? That's why, that immunization issue. But one experiment I enjoyed, of Duflo is feminization of governance. Whether that lead to, increase in, what you call accepting the gender-related investment in your budgetary decisions. And in that experiment, I think she got it affirmative that more women at the local level, when they are at the decision-making levels, that could improve the public expenditure decisions favoring women. That experiment was okay. And Ashwini also highlighted that critical mass, the importance of that. We need diversity when we talk about governance process and feminization of governance. That gender budgeting is also a governance question. It is also about implementation. It's not only about what we decide in terms of financial inputs. So these were the quick micro level experiments I thought that I will share. Now, coming back to the macro level, the macro constraints affect gender budgeting. In the sense, now we have an accommodative physical space. Like we think that deficit is good. But otherwise, we have a fiscal rule. We have to keep deficit to 3% of GDP. And that fiscal consolidation, if we are proceeding through expenditure compression, when there is revenue uncertainty, when revenues are not buoyant, we are compelled to go for expenditure compression. So what will be the decision there? We will compress expenditure which are primarily human development in nature, related in nature. So that will affect gender budgeting. So the overall macroeconomic framework also affects gender budgeting. But now we have an accommodative fiscal space. So now this is a time in which we can reprioritize, and we need to identify gender budgeting as a public financial management long-term policy tool, because economic stimulus packages are short-run and we have to go for the normalization procedure today or tomorrow. And by 2025, we have to go back to that 3% of GDP or something. Deficit needs to be controlled. But this accommodative fiscal policy stance, this time, we may be able to prioritize gender budgeting as a powerful public financial management long-term tool to go for, transparency and accountability. And when I talk about transparency, it is not only the announcements, because we have a lot of announcements in terms of the pandemic packages, but we have to wait and see in the February budget, we get the actuals of this pandemic packages we have announced. If there is a huge gap between the promises and the actually realized, then the story is partial. And that budget credibility is equally important in the time of pandemic, that effectiveness. Ruchita, I will stop here and take questions. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Chakraborty. It was a very expansive presentation, and I'm sure when we collate and we bring out the outcome document, we will come back to you for more of your comments on that.
Yeah.
But for now, we will open the floor for all the presenters, and we will take questions to any of the earlier presenters. So if you have the questions, you can either drop them at the chat box or unmute yourself and ask, or raise your hand. We will unmute yourself. So the floor is now open. Thank you. Before our participants ask any questions, I would ask my co-coordinator, Dr. Partha Sahu, if he has any comments or questions on today's presentation. Dr. Sahu, are you here?
But Anita ma'am has raised hand. Let her ask the question.
Okay.
Anita
Dr.
Brandon, madam.
Please. Yeah. Dr. Brandon, please unmute yourself. Yes, you are unmuted.
Yes. So it has been, again, hats off to NIRD for organizing these interesting and enriching webinars. And today also, all the three speakers have brought to the fore very enlightening perceptions and ground realities. Now, I don't have a question as such, but I would like to add on to the discussion. Hearing all the three august speakers, I have to flag 3-4 actionable agenda points which may be added to the way forward, recommendations. While Professor Deshpande very quickly flagged about investing in childcare, safe transport, safe public spaces, and infra support for domestic work to bring women to the fore and to promote gender equality and reduce gender gaps. I would like to also flag the attention of NIRD to really become an advocate of gender rights in the context of ensuring gender equity in land rights. Because now this scheme is there, the Swamitva scheme, which Government of India, Ministry of Panchayati Raj and Rural Development are promoting drone mapping and giving land pattas and land titles. But I am not aware whether they are really engendering the process and ensuring some kind of engendering of giving of land rights or joint titles to men and women, because the point that was flagged by our last speaker, Professor Lekha Chakrabarti, and she made a very pertinent point that women are treated as unbankable clients. Why is that so? When we have some 75 to 80 lakh women in SHGs, and yet despite the empowerment socially and acting as thrift credit groups, they are treated as unbankable clients, is a sad story. And that's largely because they don't have any collateral security. They don't have land rights. And even promoting somebody, one of the speakers also, I think Professor Lekha Chakrabarti flagged that you have to bring women in agriculture as an important intervention. But women are already doing all the farm work, more than 70%. But because they lack land rights, that work is not recognized and they are not treated as bankable entities. That's my point one. Now, point two that I would like to flag is awareness generation for women empowerment through legal literacy and through changing mindsets is very important, because merely having thrift and credit groups and the social capital created is not really working, because I am alarmed to note that the latest NFHS data reveals that more than 50%, 50 to 80% women are treating wife beating and domestic violence as right. They are consenting to it. And especially coming from states like Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Karnataka, and even Kerala, where 50 to 80% women are, voicing that wife beating is okay and men are entitled to do it and they are entitled to suffer. So this kind of mindset has to be broken through rigorous promotion of legal literacy and awareness generation through Anganwadi centers, through women self-help groups, and even through our panchayats. That's very important. And the third point that I would like to flag is, which Professor Lekha Chakrabarti also mentioned and Professor Deshpande also mentioned, is about creating gender responsive infrastructure. Because we may do all kinds of, we may have plethora of RD schemes, but if we still lack safe transport, safe public spaces, and no supportive infrastructure for reducing the burden of housework and their day-to-day subsistence work of fetching water and fuel wood, etc., that is a major gap. Now we may be coming up with a bill to equalize the age at marriage as 21 for both women and men. But when our second speaker, Sandhya ji, she was revealing the data that 23% girls still get married below age 18. So merely legislating to increase the age to age 21 will not work any wonders when we still have about a quarter of our girls getting married below age 18. So a lot of work has to be done to empower women in terms of legal literacy for both men and women in these family life education programs and family skilling programs. They have to move beyond just contraceptive choices or family planning. They have to move to becoming assertive programs of self-assertion also, and for claiming their space in terms of their rights-based equality. So these are a few points that come to my mind. Thank you for the opportunity. And I again congratulate the speakers for enlightening us and NIRD for giving us this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brandon. Thank you for very aptly summing up the webinar today. And unfortunately, I see that we are well past our designated time. So we will not be able to take any questions at this moment. But of course, if there are any questions, any comments, we are always happy to connect you with our speakers so that you can continue your work along with them. Dr. Partha, if you have any comments, please share, and then we can maybe wind up the program.
Yeah, one I had thought to ask about the requirement, the ingredient that we need, gender disaggregated data to understand where we are now and where we want to move. That is also not available. On many dimensions of this gender, we don't have data. So I was thinking to request Professor Deshpande to reflect on that. That's one. Second, in this pandemic time, the women-led, the women-owned enterprises, in fact, have emerged as a big safety net for the whole family. So this is the right time, and Professor Chakraborty, in fact, talked about that, how whatever they are presently doing, if we can help them to scale up, expand, and grow, linking with the market or providing credit, that will be great. These are two observations, and on my personal behalf, I thank all the three panelists and all participants, and I request you to close the session. Thank you, Ruchira.
Thank you, Dr. Partha. Professor Deshpande actually had another engagement, so she had to leave. But Professor Chakraborty, would you like to take the question posed by Dr. Partha?
I can't agree with him more on this, because women needs to be supported by the credit, especially in the time of pandemic. Only one point I would like to highlight is our pandemic package was a credit narrative. It was a credit linked package, but maybe along with that, when she does some programs, economic activity, if the demand side of the economy is down, then when there is no takers for her product, and then when she comes, when it comes to repayment of loan, then she will be in mess. So that's why we need to have credit linked programs plus demand stimulating programs as well. Both are equally important. I agree with you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chakraborty. Yes, I agree with Dr. Sahu that we also have a lot of lag when it comes to data, especially gendered disaggregated data. With these insights from our speakers and of course engage from our participants and our audiences, I would now like to wind up the program officially. I thank all of you for engaging with us, for joining the program, patiently hearing the presentation and sharing your thoughts and your questions with us. We will definitely collate all these insights that we are collecting, and we are going to out a proceeding later on, but that's for the future. For now, I would request you to keep engaging with us and stay with us in our future programs as well. So with those notes, I now thank you for thank the speakers, Professor Lekha Chakraborty, Professor Ashwini Deshpande, Dr. K.G. Sandhya for their presentations. I thank the NIRDPR faculty for their patient hearing and staying, and all the other audience as well for joining. And we will see you in our next webinar. Thank you and good afternoon.